A few days ago, the Sailing Alpha released, and with it a first true glimpse into Oldschool Runescape's newest skill. A new skill in many ways is like adding a brand new continent to the game, never before seen. It's uncharted territory with its own pitfalls and potential game-breaking iterations. Due to RuneScape's history and the very inception of Oldschool Runescape in 2013, the OSRS community has always been cautious about these kinds of evolutions, because a prior evolution quite literally killed their favorite game. Today, I don't want to discuss the merits and flaws of sailing as much as I want to analyze the discourse surrounding it and, full disclosure, defend its place in the game. I'm not a RuneScape old head. I love the reminiscent aesthetics of the game and what is its old school vibe, but I am not begotten to many of its antiquated systems, and if you are, fair warning, you may hear some hot takes in this video. Well over a year ago, Sailing won 2 polls, the first of which was a plurality of votes with 36.4%, and the second of which is the majority poll with 71.9%. I want to be clear in that the numbers here are almost irrelevant. I think conversations about a couple percent are Trojan horses for criticism. Whether Sailing received 75 or 72% would not have meaningfully changed the conversation happening today. Instead, let's first discuss Sailing's place in the game to determine whether a new skill is even appropriate and if a new skill like Sailing fits within the intersectional relationships present between each other skill. Sailing has been criticized in the following ways. 1. It doesn't feel like a skill and/or it feels like a minigame. 2. It's boring. And 3. A contextual response to arguments made for sailing, so something that we'll get into toward the end of the video. The first and most important function to acknowledge is sailing as a support skill. For those that don't know, there are 4 different kinds of skills in RuneScape: combat, gathering, artisan, and support. Combat is self-explanatory, gathering sees you, well, gather. Artisan synergizes with certain gathering skills, such as farming into herb lore or mining into smithing to create useful output, and support skills are a strange mix of everything: slayer, thieving, and agility. These are skills that exist to augment other skills in general overworld engagement. Slayer gives you access to unique items, dungeons, and combat benefits. Thieving was meant to at one point be a moneymaker and now feels vestigial with minimal use. And finally, the oft-maligned agility that improves your energy use while running, as well as giving you access to a whole host of useful and not so useful shortcuts. Support skills have their place, however they are much more difficult to reason. Slayer is a great example. It's a skill where you do combat, and combat already has 7 skills associated with it. Why do we need a skill that gives us the opportunity to kill random enemies around the world? That seems somewhat silly. What is preventing me, logically, from attacking an abyssal demon right now as opposed to at 85 Slayer? These arbitrary limitations are direct parallels to common criticisms levied at sailing. Why do we need to sail to islands when we can teleport? Well, for the very same reason we need 95 Slayer to combat the alchemical Hydra. It's a reward for the skill, and that reward yields supportive outputs to other skills that would otherwise suffer if those outputs were available instantly and with little effort. For example, the high-level Slayer requirement for certain bosses can be seen as an anti-botting measure. They can also be seen as appropriately scaled to the kinds of rewards given. Slayer is an incredibly easy, incredibly monotonous skill, and the bosses available are somewhat easy as well. But the rewards are pretty game-changing, and as we know, RuneScape has 2 equally valuable platforms for offering reward: time and mechanical skill. Time investment is at the core of RuneScape. It's a long-term MMO that asks many days, weeks, months, and even years from you to achieve its most coveted items. That is the heart of this MMO. That is why the majority of your time in RuneScape is spent honing a skill opposed to the traditionally understood mechanical skills present in video games. You aren't clicking heads like in Counter-Strike, you're patiently waiting 250 hours to get 99 agility. Patience is a virtue as much as it is a skill, which is why obtaining such a skill cape is an achievement, and certain skill capes with more approachable and AFKable training methods such as star mining have been devalued over time. That's not a bad or good thing, but it is a fact. So time, which is to say patience, is the first and foremost skill required to play RuneScape. Mechanical know-how is of course still there, with copious amounts of skill expression possible, but in the purview of skilling as a branch of gameplay, the former is far more prevalent than the latter. Skills are monotonous, often dry, and even more engaging training methods like tick manipulation or some of the skilling minigames become that way after well over 100 hours of investment. Anything tends to become boring the more often you repeat it. To return to Slayer, the time investment required to level the skill is proportionally rewarded with access to high-level Slayer bosses that, for minimal effort, yield incredibly powerful rewards. That is the progression of the skill, and likely what people really enjoy about it. Output in general is responsible for skill enjoyment in RuneScape. As I said, any skill, great or not, gets mind-numbing after 100 hours of training, so what makes those 100 hours well spent is the proportionate reward for the time demanded. That is why agility as opposed to Slayer is seen so negatively, not just because the process of doing combat is marginally more enjoyable than rooftops, but because the output for agility is so minor, especially for non-Ironman accounts that can just use stamina pots whenever they want. Shortcuts are also just such a trivial unlock, certain ones notwithstanding. The graceful outfit is the only tangible point of progression for the skill, and that is obtained not even 1/10 of the way through training it. If a skill asks your time and your attention in equal parts, yet you are underwhelmed by its reward, you are less likely to look favorably at that skill. Mining, on the other hand, offers almost nothing, but also asks almost nothing from you other than clicking once every 5 or so minutes. That's of course for main players, not for Ironman, where it has marginally more use cases such as Amethyst and Molten Glass. Slayer is enjoyed in part due to how impactful the output is, and how transformative the items are for other combat skills. The same does not apply to agility, and by and large, to thieving. Now that we've broken down some positives and negatives of skilling, let's determine sailing's output. The rewards are actually most similar to that of Slayer in that you unlock new islands, like monsters, as you progress that grant you access to more convenient and even unique skilling benefits. Slayer does not grant you the item, it grants you the opportunity to obtain that item. That's what a support skill does, and sailing fits that paradigm perfectly. There are also more rewards coming to sailing, such as entirely new methods to train pre-existing skills, but we don't know all too much about those yet. The final reward space for sailing, and one that is almost as exciting as the first, is its own insular progression path. This is something that we cannot look past. For some time now, Oldschool Runescape has struggled with reward space. It's something that Mod Arcane talked about many months back, and I can't stop thinking about it. Osrs is a simple game that is rendered complex through the way binary interactions interact with one another. The complexity comes from simplicity connected to other simplicity. However, on its own, it's very challenging to create depth within just the binary simple design in a vacuum. For example, melee combat has 3 styles to it: crush, stab, and slash. There are also secondary systems, such as attack speeds and special attacks, and also arguably a tertiary system with distance, such as halberd range. That's it. With every new encounter introduced, Jagex needs to find a new way to remix this incredibly limited system and output a reward that is both satisfyingly powerful, yet not devaluing pre-existing items. The concern for devaluing items is as a result of RuneScape's sandbox nature striving to retain meaning in even the oldest content. What you end up getting is a whole host of incredibly incremental rewards. We recently saw this with the Varlamore Part 3 failed reward proposals for the new endgame fight. I truly do not envy Jagex, because the amount of space they've afforded themselves is tight to say the least, because the difference between a regular endgame weapon and a mega rare isn't large enough to sustain 10 years of progression. Hell, it's barely enough to sustain half of that. What you end up pushing up against is introducing new, difficult, grindy content that outputs underwhelming items. 4 strength bonus, 2% magic damage, and God knows what else. Jagex has multiple options to deal with this, but each one will likely feed into some player negativity. Let's say they introduce new items that are even more powerful than mega rares. That would devalue the mega rare and also power creep all at once. Let's say they introduce more complexity to combat, such as new attack styles to facilitate horizontal progression. Well, that can work, but only so much horizontal progression can exist within combat before every single combat encounter starts to feel like you're playing rock, paper, scissors with weaknesses. I generally support some kind of change, but in the scope of a new mechanic entirely, but maybe that'll be a video for another time. Finally, Jagex can just introduce other progression paths that exist alongside the ones we have today. That is exactly what sailing seeks to do. There's a reason why the developers of this new skill are so talkative about the progression loop, because that is an issue with the game they're trying to fix with this skill. They want to create a system of progression that is as deep as itemization is in RuneScape, yet it doesn't power creep the combat while also not adding to the combat in any ways that may upset the players. This is very much in line with what a support skill would do in theory and what a modern iteration of a support skill would look like in my eyes. Instead of just being a platform to unlock content for different skills, it can also be its own insular progression path as well. That's part of the satisfaction of leveling it. Output for sailing then is a mixture of augmentations for just about every other skill in the game, including sailing itself. As you customize your boat, you are able to do what you do faster, more conveniently, and hopefully with more enjoyment. But how do you do this? That is where we come to our first criticism. Sailing feels like a minigame. And I'd agree, it does feel like a minigame, but we need to dig deeper to establish why that's bad, because to me, that sounds good. Each one of my favorite skilling methods in the game comes from a minigame. I prefer Wintertod to firemaking, Temporos to fishing, Guardians of the Rift to runecraft, and Hollowed Sepulchre to agility. It's not even a competition. A minigame in this case is a repeatable sequence of events that train a skill in a small, often instanced environment. The latter portion is of course untrue for sailing. Sailing is not instanced, and the environment that you're training it in is almost as large as the overworld is right now. But the repeatable sequence is more akin to something like Wintertod or Giant's Foundry than, say, blowing molten glass or mixing potions. It involves interaction with the outside world far more than most skills do. Most skills are done within your inventory as you click one item on another and then wait for a couple moments as the process completes itself. Sailing does use this paradigm, particularly with salvaging, but it isn't defined by it. The entirety of crafting happens in your UI. Sailing, even in salvaging, still asks you to interact and engage with the overworld of the game as much as your UI, which, quite frankly, lends more immersion to the skilling process, even if immersion is often irrelevant for old-school RuneScape players. So sailing feels like a minigame in that it requires a more complex set of actions to train. I'm still struggling to understand why that's a bad thing. If we are to support skilling being more than just AFK or more than just clicking to objects in an inventory, then I would think we'd want a skill to push past that envelope and utilize the iterative processes Jagex introduced with skilling minigames and skilling bosses. Most people do Wintertod. Jagex would be foolish to create a skill more like line fires. The other interpretation is that sailing feels too disconnected from the regular methods of play. And that is true, sailing is a new movement system. Unlike agility, it doesn't augment our general movement, it adds a new layer to it. And that can be very exciting for some and a little disarming for others. RuneScape is about pointing and clicking, and sailing is about pointing and clicking and then maybe readjusting as your boat takes more time to realign with whatever you just pointed and clicked at. On its surface, that sounds minor, but for many players it can be disruptive. I can recognize this while also supporting what Jagex has done here. They've retained the general movement systems of RuneScape while adapting them to a new environment. And this adaptation begets a new kind of skill set. Alongside this, they have added the kinds of training method diversities only present after 15-odd years of skilling updates. Sailing is essentially launching in the state that most skills have yet to even reach. It's launching with its own unique training method that synergizes with its movement and a small collection-driven exploration system. These two things have never been done before in Old School. But it's also launching with things that are more recognizable. Salvaging is akin to woodcutting and fishing. Ports tasks are akin to hunter rumors, mahogany homes, and even slayer tasks. Barracuda trials are reminiscent of the Hollowed Sepulchre, which is like the best part of agility, but it also utilizes a totally different skill set. Hollowed Sepulchre is a memorization game and a precision game. You're executing a tick-perfect string of movements between predetermined tiles. The Barracuda trials are more improvisational as you chart your own path with less tick-perfect movement. They value positioning, adaptation, and forethought a lot more than Hollowed Sepulchre while losing the tick-perfect nature of Hollowed Sepulchre. Sailing will also be getting combat, which we have yet to see, but seems like a bespoke activity that allows you to fight sea creatures for reward. It's a training method, but it prioritizes loot and can potentially synergize with other methods as well. Perhaps a port task that asks you to kill a creature and deliver its materials to a port across the continent for a beefy reward. That is a mixture of a Slayer task and a Hunter rumor. On launch, Sailing will have a more diverse palette of training options than any skill has ever launched with, and quite frankly, most skills have right now. I personally don't enjoy port tasks, so I will likely be doing less of those, but thankfully, I have so many other options to do instead. The second criticism is that Sailing is boring, and I would agree. But every skill is boring. I'm unsure where this criticism goes after this observation. The novelty of a new training method wears off, and what you're left with is two options: enter a flow state or get bored. I'm not sure how Jagex is meant to create a 200-hour skill in Oldschool Runescape while not leaning on the expected norms of Oldschool Runescape's training. I will say that Sailing is less boring than most skills because it's done by, playing the game more so than just clicking two objects in your UI and waiting, but it does get monotonous. I struggle to think of any skill in the entire game that doesn't. And that's fine. I'm a fervent defender of boredom, as crazy as that may seem. I think boredom can exist as a point of friction in game design and simultaneously be something to overcome with patience to achieve a reward. Oldschool Runescape isn't a game servicing a crowd needing immediate fixes of dopamine. That has never been the case. What I find especially bizarre about this criticism is that it's coming from people who value Oldschool Runescape as it once was. It was more boring, less training methods, and those that did exist were far slower. Agility prior to Hallowed Sepulchre, Runecraft prior to Guardians of the Rift, Firemaking prior to Wintertod. These are all updates that do have flaws, but they add depth and diversity to the skill while not devaluing the training methods that existed beforehand. But in a more tangible sense, isn't creating a skill that is repetitive, monotonous, and offers a grand reward like the function of every single skill in the entire game? People love Slayer, but it's literally AFKing monsters for 300 hours. You don't even unlock Slayer bosses until you're 100 hours in, and the ones you do unlock are absolutely terrible, from Sire to Cerberus to the Gargoyles. I find it bizarre to conclude that Sailing is just too boring for Oldschool Runescape when in its first 30 levels it has presented far more skill expression and purpose than Slayer has in its first 80 levels. In fact, that applies to every skill. This segues perfectly to our third criticism, the contextual responses to what I'm saying right now. One of the most common rebuttals to anyone bringing up that every RuneScape skill is somewhat boring by both design and necessity is that Sailing should be held to a higher standard. Why are we comparing it to shitty older skills? Shouldn't the new skill be better? Yeah, it should be, and I think it is, as I just pointed out with Slayer. The first 30 levels of any skill in the entire game has never offered this amount of diverse training methods and appropriate reward. It often takes quadruple that time to even begin to receive anything meaningful from associated skills or even unlock the more adequate and fun training methods you may prefer. But more importantly, don't we want Sailing to feel connected to the game? Don't we want Sailing to feel like Oldschool Runescape? Don't we want it to feel like other skills do? One of the more confounding principles of this community, not everyone but some people, is both a want to remain old school and traditional to not replace dogshit fights like Calphite Queen or even update the silly mammoth model, while embracing 750 different plugins tracking your farming, raids layouts, equipment loadouts, daily reset, hydration, and parents' birthday. And yet those very same people want Sailing to be completely and fundamentally different than every other skill in the game, while also potentially criticizing it for not feeling like part of the game. Perhaps it's different camps airing these criticisms, and Jagex will of course never please everyone, but as someone who still finds themselves looking into this community more so than from it, it's a very disarming experience trying to understand what some people even want from this game. I guess this all culminates with a question. What do you want Sailing to be? It's not being removed from the game, and that's because it passed 2 polls, so now we're tasked with finding a way to make it a skill that most people accept and enjoy. But to do so, we need to engage in more deep and productive conversations than simply defaulting to Trojan horse criticisms. It's boring, it's a minigame, and so on. On their surface, these criticisms are fine, but in context they begin to lose meaning. Every skill in this game is boring in the same way sailing is, and Jagex is smart to keep sailing within the same structural and systemic philosophies that define other skills. It needs to feel like it belongs. It can't exist as totally separate and alien, even if it's new. In some ways, sailing does feel like a minigame, but every skill kind of does. That's because any skill that gets a minigame becomes so connected to that minigame. Even if you don't do Giant's Foundry, you're likely doing Blast Furnace, also a minigame. You're definitely doing Wintertod, you're certainly doing Guardians of the Rift, at least until level 77 or just the full outfit. And that applies to most minigames, but where sailing differs is that it doesn't just feel like a minigame. While certain skills have been subsumed by their associated minigames, sailing simply offers the opportunity to engage with a different training method. If the Barracuda Trials or just the general sailing feels too much like a minigame, then you may enjoy Ports tasks. Those are like Hunter Rumors, but are also like Slayer tasks, which I suppose may also feel like a minigame. In that case, the entirety of Slayer is a minigame, which I don't know, where's that energy? Or you can do salvaging. That at no point feels like a minigame. It is more akin to a distraction and diversion like shooting stars or even like traditional woodcutting and fishing. If you wonder where the purpose of sailing lies, then the expansion of the map and its newly unlockable portions should hopefully satiate that curiosity. Much like Slayer, this support skill's primary reward system outside of its own progression is the ability to augment the other skills and even introduce new elements to them. New trees, new weapons, new Slayer bosses and enemies, and so on. Put bluntly, if sailing doesn't feel like a skill, then neither do most skills in the game, and if we want sailing to be an evolution of skilling in RuneScape unshackled by the expectations of the past, then why is that interest only applied to skilling? Why not movement? Why not bossing? Why not combat? I think sailing is quite good. I was a little bit interested in it prior, but have come out of the alpha a lot more excited for the full release, because what I've seen in the alpha already surpasses every single skill's first 30 levels. Most may not recognize this because the meta for new RuneScape accounts is to speedrun quests until they skip those early levels, but that should be a demonstration of just how weak leveling is early on in RuneScape. It's the meta to skip it. With sailing, Jagex has the opportunity to harness their hindsight and develop a skill with the quality of life that most skills only receive after years of updates. And from what I've seen, they've done just that. But more positively, sailing feels like a second chance to avoid the pitfalls of old skills, to design something that is utilized fully rather than just through one or two mini-games. Imagine if smithing was actually used to create weapons and armor, the original purpose of the skill. It also just reminds me of Oldschool Runescape. After the irreparable damage caused by the evolution of combat, Jagex utilized its hindsight to avoid those very same pitfalls in their development of Osrs, and has a superior game as a result. If we acknowledge this, then why not let them cook? I think there's a bright future ahead for RuneScape, and if you're a sailing hater, then fair. It may just have to join many of the other skills in the game that are often avoided. But from everything I've seen, from the responsiveness of the developers to the great ideas provided by the players, I can't really imagine a world where sailing ruins anything. In fact, I can only imagine a world where the world itself grows.